Section 4 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2. The First Metaphysicians, Part 1. 1. The Religious Revival. In all times and countries, the philosophy of a nation has been intimately related to its religious beliefs. And if this is true of modern European thought, which has Greek thought to build on as an independent foundation, much more is it true of the original Greek thought, which started without any such inheritance from the past. Now it is a remarkable fact that Greek philosophy, as it goes on evolving, seems to have come into closer and closer connection with popular religious belief, with the current pagan theology. Among ourselves, as is well known, rather the reverse process obtains. Since the Middle Ages, speculation has tended, on the whole, to break away from dogmatic trammels. Fully to set out the causes of what seems to us so singular an inversion of the natural order would require a volume, and indeed the problem is one that classical scholarship has not yet completely elucidated. But a few summary indications will be found helpful for the intelligence of what is to follow. The Greeks had not one religion, but two religions, or rather they had many religions, the objects of which group themselves under two general headings, according as their home was in the heavens or under the earth. We speak of the one class as Olympian, of the other class as Chthonian deities. The Olympian gods, typified above all by the great triad, Zeus, Apollo, and Athena, were associated in a peculiar way with the bright upper sky and the sun. Apart from their human interests, they enjoyed unchanging and immortal felicity. The Chthonian gods are associated in the first instance with the dead, and their shadowy chief Pluto exists only as a personification of the grave. But they are also conceived in a more concrete way as powers of vegetation and growth, of what is sent up from the underworld to the earth's surface, whether plants or springing waters. And these find their most characteristic representatives in Demeter, literally Mother Earth, her daughter Persephone, and Dionysus, originally a god of all subterranean springs, but tending to become specialized as a wine god. From their great prominence in Greek classic literature, the Olympian gods have come to figure in our imagination as the proper objects of Greek worship and the centres of Greek religious belief. It seems likely that the religion of the higher classes, whose thoughts and feelings classic literature above all expresses, was in fact Olympian, turning itself by preference to the bright and immortal aspects of nature. On the other hand, it was to be expected that the vast labouring population, whose interests lay especially in agriculture, should turn by preference to the Chthonian gods, to the givers of corn and wine and oil. These two were more human, more sympathetic than the Olympians, in that they shared man's mortality and grief. Every year Demeter, the earth goddess, mourns for her daughter Persephone, the flower-crowned spring, carried off by the king of death to share his subterranean throne. Every year Dionysus, the vine god, gives his body to be torn to pieces and mangled by the vintage and the winepress. Nor did the process of assimilation end here. From the idea of a dying god came forth the idea of an undying life for man. Persephone returns to her mother every spring in a resurrection of leaves and flowers, and by a still more significant symbolism, Dionysus, the twice-born, first from the fruitful vine, then from the wine vat, celebrates a joyful immortality in that life-giving draught which gladdens the hearts of gods and men. Thus for mortal men also, the grave came to be thought of as the gateway to another existence, though not necessarily to an existence of everlasting joy. For as it is the very law of life that death should be dreaded, if we cease to fear death as the end of all our happiness here, we must learn to fear it as opening the possibility of endless unhappiness hereafter. It is an economic law that morality should be more prized and more practised among the lower than among the higher classes of society. For justice is the appeal of the poor against the tyranny of the rich, and temperance is the guardian of the poor against the vicious self-indulgence and extravagance which are so much more speedily fatal to them than to the rich. Hence we find a distinctly more moral tone in Hesiod, who addressed himself to the hard-working rural population, than in Homer, who addressed himself to the idle and warlike aristocracy. Thus, when a belief in human immortality came to be developed out of the Chthonian religion, it was utilized by the superior moral feeling of the industrial classes as an additional sanction for the laws of right and wrong. A state of future rewards and punishments is unknown to the authors of the Iliad, but we find a scheme of retributive justice after death set out in what critics suppose to be a late addition to the Odyssey. It is a common experience to find the belief in another world utilized by a particular class to further their own interests by working on the superstitious imagination of the vulgar, and such seems to have been also the case in Greece. An elaborate system of ritualistic observances took the place of righteous conduct as a passport to the dwellings of the blessed, and bloody sacrifices came into high repute as a means of expiating real or imaginary guilt. Such phenomena as revivalism and salvationism were not without their counterpart in old Hellas. Only there, the first stimulus to these tumultuous manifestations of religious feeling seems to have been imported from among the barbarous Thracians, or from the rot heaps of decaying Semitic civilization. Two general causes, subsequently reinforced by a third, operated in the 6th century B.C. to set on foot a great religious movement, beginning with the lower strata of Greek society and spreading upward till it absorbed the highest. A great wave of Asiatic conquest, started long before, but only becoming formidable to the west when it came under the energetic direction of Persia, brought with it a general sense of insecurity and terror most favourable to religious excitement. Simultaneously with this, the growth of democracy in the Greek city-states gave a new prominence to the popular faiths whose nature has just been analysed, imposing them even on the higher classes, and endangering the old aristocratic ideal of sophrosony, that is, self-limitation and self-control. The Ionians had always been a colonizing race, and under the stress of Persian conquest, their migratory tendency received an additional impulse. New settlements were founded in southern Italy, and some of these became the homes of philosophic schools marked by extraordinary originality of thought, but somewhat lacking in the sanity and balance so characteristic of Ionian speculation in its first beginnings, steadied as these were by the traditions of an immemorial civilization. 2. The Pythagorean school. Considerable uncertainty prevails in regard to the chronology of the Italian schools, and our authorities hold conflicting views about their origin and mutual relations. Pythagoras, whom for convenience we may take first, is an especially problematic figure. There is good contemporary evidence for the fact of his existence, but in what we are told about him, the historical element, if any, is not easily distinguishable from the mythical. To be made the subject of marvellous legends or inventions is usually the fate of prophets or religious teachers rather than of philosophers, and in fact there is good reason to believe that Pythagoras belonged to both orders, to the lovers of simple knowledge for whom, as will be remembered, he is said to have invented that incomparable name, philosopher, and to those others who also claim truth for their heritage, but with a higher warrant than mere reason can give, to the class whom we generally call mystics. According to the best of our information, the life of Pythagoras extended through the greater part of the 6th century B.C. and ended with its close. Thus he came under the double influence of the scientific movement started by Thales and of the great religious movement known as Orphicism. Orpheus was a mythical personage who stood godfather to a vast spurious literature, the scriptures of a new salvationist method, the worship of a dying god, and the hope of a blessed hereafter. Pythagoras associated this belief in immortality with the old Oriental doctrine of metempsychosis. He or his disciples taught that the eternal soul passed through a series of reincarnations, rising or falling in the scale of existence, according as each earthly life had or had not been spent in accordance with the law of purity. As a help towards leading the perfect life, Pythagoras founded a religious order to which women were admitted equally with men. At what period the sage began his social experiments is not known. Perhaps an attempt to set up the order in his native island of Samos may have excited the wrath of Polycrates, its brilliant and successful tyrant. At any rate, Pythagoras fled from Samos and settled in Croton, an Achaean colony on the Gulf of Tarentum. There, under his direction, the order flourished for many years until, like some more modern churches, it tried to obtain political supremacy in alliance with the aristocratic faction. A popular tumult, in which, according to some accounts, Pythagoras himself perished, put an end to the reforming movement as an organized community. But as a ferment of thought, the school lived on, exercising an unparalleled influence on the whole later course of Greek philosophy, down to the final extinction of paganism under the Roman Empire. End of Section 4. Section 5 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2. The First Metaphysicians, Part 2. 3. Pythagorean Science and Philosophy. Much learning does not give intelligence, or Pythagoras would have possessed it. So, with his usual scornfulness, wrote a somewhat later sage, the celebrated Heraclitus. And as a general principle, the sarcasm is not without truth, as many a modern instance teaches. But it was not true of Pythagoras. If tradition may be trusted, he had not only mastered all the knowledge of his age, but had enriched it with important discoveries. He is said to have demonstrated the most fruitful proposition of elementary geometry, the theorem that the square on the base of a right-angled triangle equals the sum of the squares on the two containing sides. And he is also credited with the discovery that the height of notes on the musical scale is determined by the proportionate lengths of the chords by whose vibration they are produced, so that a vibrating string of half the length produces a note an octave higher. How much of the astronomy peculiar to his school goes back to its first founder we cannot tell. But he seems to have started that daring course of speculation which resulted between 2 and 3 centuries after his time in the theory, revived by Copernicus from Greek science, that the earth revolves on her own axis and is carried with the planets round the sun as the central orb of the system to which we belong. No European teacher has ever been so completely identified with his school as Pythagoras, and if this fact precludes any accurate distinction between the original contributions of the master to science and the subsequent additions made by his disciples, it makes the task of determining what was individual to him in philosophy almost impossible. In after ages, the central Pythagorean doctrine undoubtedly was that all things are made out of number. Not, be it observed, that numbers, or more generally mathematical relations, constitute the very soul of nature, but that number is, like the water of Thales or the air of Anaximenes, the very stuff of which the world is made. But this seems too abstract a theory, not to say too subtle and elaborate, for so primitive a philosopher as Pythagoras himself to have constructed even an outline, nor do we find any reference to it among his immediate successors. What we do find them referring to as a current notion is the system of opposites, the idea that the universe is built up out of antithetical couples, the limit and the unlimited, the one and the many, rest and motion, light and darkness, good and evil. To conceive things in general, and more particularly human affairs, under the form of balanced opposition, was a fixed mental habit of the Greeks. Our very word antithesis, taken straight from their language, still perpetuates that form of thought among ourselves, although no modern, not even Macaulay, has pushed its use to such excess. By its help, Homer and Herodotus arranged their materials. By its laws, the great sculptors disposed the reliefs on the pediments of the temples they had to adorn with groups of statuary. As a rhetorical artifice, it disfigures the noble eloquence of Thucydides. In philosophy, we find the employment of antithetical couples first exemplified by Anaximander, who, as will be remembered, assumes an eternal infinite, out of which the finite and perishable things of experience are formed, developing such contrasted qualities as heat and cold, dryness and wetness, by a process of differentiation from its homogeneous substance. We may suppose that the individual service of Pythagoras was to take up and generalize this fundamental idea, bringing the great social conflict of good and evil into line with the universal processes by which order is evolved out of chaos. 4. Heraclitus. So far, the philosophers with whom we have had to deal have been little more than names, distinguished from one another by purely intellectual attributes, not recognizable as living personalities. But Greece was the very land of strongly marked, vivid, individual characteristics, as the Homeric poems already show, and the personal note, so conspicuous for 2 centuries in her lyric poets, could not fail ultimately to make itself felt in the creations of abstract thought. It meets us for the first time in Heraclitus of Ephesus, universally acknowledged as the greatest of the pre-Socratic philosophers, and probably destined to rank for original genius among the greatest that the world has ever seen. We may add that with him the separation of philosophy from science in the strict sense begins. His interest lies solely with the one universal law of nature, possibly generalized from particulars, but not dependent on them, rather dictating to them what they shall be. Science and common sense have always protested against such an assumption. Our own Francis Bacon has given the weightiest and most splendid expression to their protest, but others were found to utter it long before him. We have to ask, however, whether science itself could have dispensed with those paradoxes of pure thought, whether Bacon himself did not miss more truth by a servile adhesion to supposed facts than the Greeks missed by a sovereign disregard for them. Our personal knowledge of Heraclitus comes almost entirely from what fragments of his composition survive, for no reliance can be placed on the stories current about his life, beyond the bare statement, confirmed by some references of his own, that he flourished at the end of the 6th century B.C. Thus, in the order of succession, he comes immediately after Anaximenes, the last representative of the Milesian school, and in fact he seems to have followed the Milesian method of seeking for a universal principle, a substance of which all things are made. Two elements had already figured in that capacity, water and air. Heraclitus supersedes them by a third, which is fire. He appeals to its function as a universal medium of exchange. As goods are given for gold and gold for goods, so everything is given for fire and fire for everything. Our philosopher would have entered heartily into the modern speculation that every form of energy is electric, and the whole material world merely so much congealed electricity. For Heraclitus, fire is what we now call the absolute, the eternally self-existent reality underlying all appearance. This order of things, cosmos, the same for all, was not made by any god or any man, but was and is and will be forever a living fire, kindled by measure and quenched by measure. If anyone likes to call the Eternal One by the consecrated name of Zeus, he may, only on the understanding, as seems to be hinted, that it is not to be the Zeus of the poets, a magnified non-natural man, but an impersonal power, and a relation rather than a substance. There is an obvious contradiction in describing fire as both ever-living and as alternately kindled and quenched, and the Ephesian sage would not have hesitated for a moment to acknowledge that there was a contradiction. For according to him, contradiction is the central fact of existence, the spring, as we should say now, that makes the wheels of the universe go round. In human affairs this is clear enough. War is the father and king of all things. It originates our social distinctions, making some gods and others men, some slaves and others free. Homer was wrong in wishing strife to perish, and he ought to be flogged out of the competitive games. It seems likely that the contempt of Heraclitus for Pythagoras may be explained by the same cause that accounts for his depreciatory estimate of Homer. When the Samian philosopher divided the great principles of nature into a series of antithetical couples, he was right, but his whole system was vitiated by the failure to perceive that these opposites are necessary to each other's existence, that the whole frame of things is determined by their conflict and interplay. And that is just what makes fire so representative an element, so fit a type of the world-pervading law. Fire lives by struggling with and assimilating its own opposites, perishing at the moment of its complete triumph. Speaking more accurately, it only seems to perish, living again as air, whose birth is the death of fire. As similarly, water lives by the death of air, earth by the death of water, and fire once more by the death of earth. 5. The flux. This endless process of transformation was summed up by the Greeks in two words, not known to have been used by Heraclitus himself, but admirably expressing his philosophy: Panta rei, all things flow. In some instances the universal flux is attested by the evidence of our senses. No man bathes twice in the same river. In others we know it by reason. A new sun rises every day, a conclusion deduced, we must suppose, from the fact that our own fires need perpetual supplies of fresh fuel to keep them burning. Solid earth must have proved, in more senses than one, a hard nut for the theory to crack. For thousands of years had still to pass before science could show that the most quiescent bodies are composed of molecules in a state of perpetual rotation and revolution. Probably Heraclitus argued that as earth is potentially fire, water, and air, it must partake in some way not evident to our imperfect senses of their mobility and evasiveness. That which in material bodies presents the appearance of a perpetual flowing from one form to another, assumes in our sensations, appetites, and ideas the still higher aspect of a universal relativity. If all things were turned to smoke, the nostrils would distinguish them, and in fact souls do smell in the underworld, where, as seems to be implied, everything is smoke. Fishes find salt water life-sustaining, which to men is poisonous. Asses prefer chopped straw to gold. Swine bathe in mud, fowls in dust or ashes. The most beautiful ape is ugly when compared with a man. The wisest or most beautiful man would be an ape compared with the gods. Good and evil are one. Physicians expect to be paid for inflicting all sorts of torments on their patients. We should not know there is such a thing as justice, did injustice not exist. To God, or as we should say, from the absolute point of view, all things are fair and good and just. The distinction between just and unjust is human. God is day and night, winter and summer, war and peace, plenty and famine. Yet for us also the union of opposites holds good. Health, goodness, satiety, and rest are made pleasant by sickness, evil, hunger, and fatigue. End of Section 5. Section 6 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 2. The First Metaphysicians, Part 3. 6. The Logos. Heraclitus might have pushed his negation of all the usual distinctions embalmed in common sense to a system of dissolving scepticism, in which every fixed principle, whether of knowledge or of action, would have disappeared. But he did not go to that extreme. After the doctrine of fire as the world element, after the dogma of an all-pervading relativity, comes the third and greatest idea of his philosophy, the idea of universal law and order. We have already come across it in that great sentence describing the cosmos as an ever-living fire, kindled and quenched according to measure. The meaning is that fire transforms itself into water, water into earth, and so on a basis of strict quantitative equivalence, so much of the one thing being paid in, and so much of the other paid out. To the same effect we are told elsewhere that the sun will not transgress his measures, or the Erinyes who guard justice will find him out. In Greek mythology, the Erinyes had for their original function to avenge the violated sanctities of blood relationship, and more particularly to punish the crime of matricide, a function subsequently extended to the punishment of all crime. By a crowning generalization, they are here thought of as the guardians of natural law in the widest sense. Our philosopher calls this world-wide law by a name which had a great future before it. It is no other than the Logos, so familiar to us as the Word proclaimed in the proem to St. John's Gospel, which became incarnate in Jesus Christ. St. John had derived it perhaps from Philo of Alexandria, Philo from the Stoics, and the Stoics from Heraclitus. To the Ephesian sage also, as to the fourth evangelist, the Logos is the light that lighteth every man that cometh into the world, the reason within him by which the cosmic reason is revealed, his individual portion of the universal fire. For just as Anaximenes had assimilated the breath of life, the animating and sustaining spirit of man, with the all-constituting air, Heraclitus assigns the same twofold activity to his elemental fire. It was a common principle in Greek philosophy that like knows like, and so the burning stream of consciousness within us recognizes the eternal flux without. recognizes it also as reasonable, or rather as more reasonable in proportion to its vastly greater dominion and duration. Agreement, community, identity are the essential notes of reality and reason. It will be remembered that the eternal order was, in modern phraseology, established as objectively true by being the same for all men. All human laws draw their sustenance from the one divine law, and to judge things truly, we should hold fast to the common reason, even more forcibly than good citizens cling to the law of the state, which they defend like the city wall, putting down the insolent self-assertion and arrogance of individuals. Individual sovereignty and the right of private judgment, divorced from reason, are fantastic illusions. Such individuality is at its height when we are asleep and dreaming, each of us in a world of his own. When we are awake, it is the same world for all. Not that Heraclitus believes in the wisdom of the majority as an infallible guide. Most people are foolish and bad, the good are few, and one man is worth 10,000 if he be the best. Nevertheless, personal authority should go for nothing. Arguments, not words, are the thing. Unfortunately, argument is thrown away on the generality, as we saw asses prefer chopped straw to gold. And the law of relativity itself explains why the law is not understood. Fire is only intelligible to the soul of fire, to the dry soul. Degenerating minds in which the vital spark turns to water are thrown out of touch with the essence of things. Theirs is a savour of death unto death. More particularly, our prophet's own countrymen, the Ephesians, are a hopeless, irreformable set with a vicious hatred for superior persons as such. Better if the adult population were all to hang themselves and leave the city to their children. Such utterances are marked with the essentially aristocratic stamp of early Greek thought. It is probable that in the case of Heraclitus, this contemptuous estimate of the vulgar was accentuated by a rationalistic disdain for the new popular religion. When he observes that the ritual of Dionysus would be shameless indecency were it not an act of divine worship, his reference, standing alone, might be meant for no more than an illustration of the universal relativity. But when taken in company with his attack on the Bacchic mysteries and the prevalent rage for secret ceremonies of all kinds, the words can only be interpreted as an unequivocal condemnation of the Orphic revival. Plato spoke no otherwise of the same manifestations 120 years later, and Huxley's comments on Salvationism are less severe. 7. Xenophanes. Among those whom Heraclitus mentions as examples of learning without intelligence, Xenophanes is one. In the order of time, this philosopher, an Ionian of Colophon, preceded the great Ephesian, but for our purposes he may be most conveniently studied in connection with a school developed in express opposition to the theory of a perpetual flux. I have called Xenophanes a philosopher, but he was primarily rather a poet of alert and many-sided interests, who spent a long life wandering about Hellas and making a profession of reciting his own compositions at the banquets of the rich. It would appear that the conversation at such social gatherings largely consisted in repeating fabulous stories about the quarrels of Titans and Centaurs, and we know from Homer that scandalous ballads about the amours of gods and goddesses were sometimes part of the entertainment. Xenophanes wished to introduce a higher tone, and as a preliminary he attacks the mythology of the old poets with uncompromising vigour. Homer and Hesiod, he exclaims, have attributed to the gods everything that is a shame and reproach among men, theft, adultery, and mutual deception. But not to think of the gods as like bad men is merely the first step in true religion. We should not think of them as like men at all. Mortals think that the gods are generated, that they have senses, a voice, and a body like their own. The Ethiopians fancy that their deities are black-skinned and snub-nosed. The Thracians give theirs fair hair and blue eyes. If oxen or lions had hands and could paint, they too would make gods in their own image. So much for the aristocratic Olympian religion of the poets. As to the popular Chthonian religion of the mysteries, with its suffering and dying gods, he is reported to have dismissed it with even briefer and more cutting sarcasm. Asked by the Eleates should they sacrifice to Leucothea and mourn for her or not, he advised them not to mourn if they believed her to be a goddess, not to sacrifice if they believed her to be a woman. For himself, Xenophanes, like Anaximander, believed in an infinite source of existence, but unlike his Milesian predecessor, he identified this one and eternal element with the visible earth, which he supposed to stretch downward beneath our feet without end. This infinite and eternal reality is God, and the only God, resembling mortals neither in form nor thought, but perceiving and thinking through its whole extent. We are told that Xenophanes created paleontology, pointing to the impressions of marine animals and plants found embedded in the quarries of Syracuse, as evidence that what is now dry land was once water, teaching also that it would at some future period be covered with water once more, a theory probably suggested by Anaximander's idea that man was evolved from a fish-like creature. 8. Parmenides. Interesting in himself, Xenophanes interests us still more as the immediate predecessor of Parmenides, the poet-thinker to whom Elea, an otherwise obscure Ionian colony in southern Italy, owes its immortal renown. Grown to manhood, as would seem, early in the 5th century B.C., and therefore a contemporary of the great Persian War, Parmenides comes a little later than Heraclitus, as whose polar opposite and complement he appears in the history of Greek philosophy. In point of genius there can be no comparison between them. Heraclitus was so much the greater of the two. Indeed, it is only within the last century that we have been able to appreciate his astonishing genius at something like its true value. At the same time, Parmenides had a more typically Greek mind, and therefore he counts for more in the history of Greek thought. Indeed, from Plato on, his ideas dominate its evolution to the end. It will be remembered that Pythagoras, or his followers, conceived reality under the form of so many antithetical couples confronting each other in unreconciled opposition: the limit and the unlimited, the one and the many, rest and motion, light and darkness being the most conspicuous among them. And it will also be remembered that Heraclitus, while fully admitting the existence of such a pervading antithesis, refused to admit it as absolute. According to his interpretation, the members of each couple are necessary to each other's existence, are always passing into one another, are in truth at bottom the same thing. Now Parmenides, starting also from the Pythagorean conception, utterly rejects this theory, and even reacts so violently against it as to deny reality to what may be called the negative side of the antithesis. There are no such things as infinity, plurality, change, or darkness. The whole of being is one uniform, unchangeable, limited, luminous sphere, without parts, without a beginning, and without an end. He describes it in verses of great power and dignity, which may be translated as follows: "The whole extends continuously, being by being, set immovable, subject to the restraint of mighty bonds, both increate and indestructible, since birth and death have wandered far away, by true conviction into exile driven. The same in self-same place, and by itself abiding, doth abide most firmly fixed, and bounded round by strong necessity. Wherefore a holy law forbids that being should be without a bound, else want were there, and want of that would be a want of all. To us moderns, with our habitual prostration before the idea of infinity, this dogmatic conclusion seems anything but self-evident, and to be without a bound strikes one as a proof of affluence rather than of destitution. But Parmenides here shows himself a true Greek, for to the Hellenic genius a boundary was associated with finish rather than with finitude. 9. The theory of being. It has been suggested that the Parmenidean conception of being as something without movement, variety, or change is not meant to describe the world of sense and experience, but rather the hidden reality that underlies sensible appearances, the world as revealed to pure intelligence, the thing in itself of modern metaphysics. This, however, is an entire misconception. Early Greek thought had not risen to the idea of a fundamental distinction between reality and appearance. The delusions it recognized were occasional, accidental, individual errors of perception, not inherent in human perception as such. What is more, Parmenides leaves no sort of doubt as to his meaning. He tells us that only what is can be conceived or even spoken of. The non-existent is also the unthinkable. Moreover, what is can never not have been, can never cease to be. In other words, what most philosophers still believe of the world as a whole, what most men of science till lately believed of material atoms, or of the smallest pulses of energy, that they are both increate and indestructible. This Parmenides believed so absolutely and universally that for him the conviction excluded the possibility even of movement and change. Suppose a body passes from one place to another, or suppose its color to be altered, say, from green to red. In either case, something that was has ceased to be, something is now that was not before. And so the very first law of existence would be broken. Being would be identical with non-being. In fact, just what was taught by Heraclitus, whose very words are quoted in this connection as a vain thing. There is another and even stronger reason for interpreting the absolute reality of Eleatic philosophy as no mysterious ideal existence, but a direct object of sensuous perception. Parmenides describes it as not only bounded, but is shaped like a perfect sphere, extending equally in all directions from a central point. And his words so evidently apply to the visible world that all subsequent thinkers who came under his influence continued for many centuries to regard the material universe as a perfect sphere. This conception had its root in a great scientific discovery, no less a discovery than that the earth is a globe. Before Parmenides, no Greek was aware of the fact, nor perhaps was any Oriental astronomer. Thales and his successors were, in more senses than one, quite at sea on the subject. Xenophanes, with every opportunity through a long life of assimilating the most advanced ideas of his age, thought that the earth stretched downwards to infinity. Now, whether Parmenides himself actually discovered the earth's sphericity is not quite certain. We can only say that there is good authority for believing that he did. That he knew it to be a fact is therefore highly probable. And this fact, so astounding, so contrary to common opinion, would influence his whole way of thinking. Its suggestiveness would, so to speak, go to his head. A sphere is the one absolutely perfect thing in experience, excluding change, excluding variety, without beginning or end, the very type of what is finished. And now it turns out that earth, the greatest thing we know, is a sphere. no more remained than to represent all existence on the same model and to invest it with every imaginable perfection. Astronomy was not the only positive science that influenced the thought of Parmenides. As a South Italian Greek, he must have come into touch with the Pythagoreans. Indeed, we have seen reason to believe that his severe monism was a protest against their dualistic view of nature. And apart from such ultimate questions, he would have much to learn from them about geometry, in which they were at that time the world's acknowledged masters. Now, geometry is the science of space, and it will be found on examination that Parmenides, in enumerating the properties of being, almost identifies them with the properties of absolute space. It is extended, continuous, homogeneous, unchanging, with parts completely immovable among one another. He did not indeed conceive it as infinite, but for the Greek philosophers, as for modern mathematicians, the infinity of space remained an open question. What really differentiated his view from ours was the ascription of intelligence to that rigid, unalterable sphere. We habitually think of mind as the unextended. To Parmenides, mind and extension were one and the same. And we need only place ourselves at his point of view to see why this should be. From the beginning, Greek thought had retained much of that animism which is the sole philosophy of primitive men. Not to repeat what has already been pointed out in the case of the Milesian school, Xenophanes, in identifying the world with God, had described it as perceiving and thinking through its whole infinite extent. And Heraclitus had represented the reasonable principle within ourselves as a fiery particle, able by virtue of its common nature to recognize and act in harmony with the cosmic fire by which the universe is shaped and directed. Parmenides moves on the same lines with his predecessors, but goes a step beyond them. According to him, mind and its object are not merely akin, they are the same. Nor indeed was any other conclusion compatible with the first principle of his system. That difference neither does nor can exist. Or again, we may say that the world without has been simplified down to pure extension. The world within has been simplified down to pure reason, which, as it merely repeats and reflects that external uniformity, is logically indistinguishable from it. After his uncompromising enunciation of absolute truth, Parmenides made the concession to common opinion of writing a sequel to his first philosophy on the lines of old Ionian speculation, in which a place is given to those negative elements of darkness, cold, and opacity, which he had begun by dismissing as unthinkable. The theory of evolution found its place here, leading up to what would now be called a materialistic view of mind, as determined by the excess of some one element in the composition of man's bodily organization. But these were accommodations to the world's opinions that the world has willingly let die. It was by his relentless paradoxes, not by his contemptuous concessions, that Parmenides exercised a decisive influence on the subsequent courses of thought. And it was through their combination with the almost equally daring paradoxes of Heraclitus that the element of truth contained in the respective systems of these two great men told for all that it was worth. End of section 6. Section 7 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 3. The Analytical Philosophers, Part 1. 1. Zeno of Elea. Parmenides seems never to have made more than one disciple. This was a young Eleat named Zeno, to whom he was united not only by common opinions, but by the bonds of devoted private affection. Yet closely as they agreed in principle, the two thinkers belonged to distinct ages with widely contrasted tendencies and methods. the one dogmatic, the other argumentative, the one more comprehensive, the other more analytic, the one potent to unite and simplify, the other excelling in subtlety and minuteness. What struck people most about the philosophy of Parmenides was that it denied motion, and to such a laughter-loving race as the Greeks, this paradox gave much occasion for ridicule. Zeno came to his master's assistance by showing, or attempting to show, that the idea of motion involves greater difficulties than its denial, and this he did by a series of examples whose interest is not exhausted even for the speculation of our own times. His most celebrated puzzle is that known as Achilles and the tortoise. Let us suppose that there is a race between the two, and that the tortoise is allowed a start, say, of 10 feet. Then Achilles will never overtake his slow-footed competitor, for while he is getting over the first 10 feet, the tortoise will have accomplished, say, 1 foot, or as much less than that as you please. Anyhow, it will be some measurable distance, however small. Then, while Achilles is traversing that space, the tortoise will have advanced through the same fraction of it as before, and so on ad infinitum. It is no answer to say that, as a matter of fact, the swifter does always overtake the slower runner. The question is how space can be conceived except as infinitely divisible, and how, granting that, an infinite number of divisions can be run through in a finite time. It has been suggested as a solution that the infinite divisibility of time makes this possible, but in fact it only doubles the difficulty, for then we have 2 infinite series to be run out instead of 1. Skeptical arguments are dangerous allies to dogmatic theories, and Zeno's method might have been turned with destructive effect against his master, for it goes to disprove the possibility of continuously extended space as a thing in itself, and this Parmenides had assumed without question, nor indeed was it questioned until thousands of years after his time. 2. Empedocles. Change and motion held their own notwithstanding all that the Eleatics could say to prove their impossibility. But Parmenides, by his daring paradoxes, had brought into full view an aspect of the truth that Heraclitus, going to the opposite extreme, had tended to obscure, and that common sense had yet to learn as something self-evident when it was once stated. This was the perpetuity through all change of a reality underlying appearance, a substance that is neither created nor destroyed. We may say that the Ionians had practically assumed the existence of such a substance, variously identifying it with one of the so-called elements, water, air, earth, or fire. But their analysis had been what chemists call qualitative rather than quantitative. They did not sharply formulate the generalization that matter persists through all metamorphoses without loss or gain. Heraclitus alone, with his wonderful sagacity, grazed but did not grasp this law. Fully to realize it was reserved for the inferior genius of Empedocles. Empedocles stands as an isolated, somewhat problematic figure among the early Greek philosophers. By exception, he was not an Ionian, but a Dorian. By exception, not an aristocrat, but a democrat. His restless and insatiable vanity also makes an unpleasant contrast with the singular personal majesty of the rest. For the first, though not for the last time in history, he makes us feel that to be a charlatan and a great thinker are not incompatible predicates. His birthplace may have had something to do with his ambiguous character and attitude. This was Acragas, the modern Girgenti, a Sicilian city, renowned for the luxury of its inhabitants and the splendor of its public edifices, still as ruins preeminent among the glories of Doric architecture. It was a chief seat of the Chthonian religion, whose two great goddesses, Demeter and Persephone, were especial objects of popular worship. Standing, moreover, almost on the frontier between Hellenic and Phoenician civilization, Acragas was exposed in a peculiar way to the evil influences of Semitic example, with the least restraint from the old Greek traditions of sophrosyney, of self-knowledge and self-control. Empedocles tells his countrymen that he walked through the Sicilian cities crowned with garlands, honored as an immortal god, followed by crowds of men and women entreating him to heal their diseases, to give them oracles, to show them the way to gain. What the multitude asked from Empedocles was no more than his philosophy undertook to give. His disciples were to learn the arts by which old age is warded off, the winds controlled, and the dead restored to life. Our prophet claimed, in fact, to be nothing less than a fallen divinity, who, in some far distant prenatal stage of existence, had stained himself with bloodshed, and was condemned, as an expiation of his guilt, to pass through a long cycle of existences, vegetable, animal, and human, as a dweller in the water, in the air, or on the earth. Apparently, the period of purification was now nearly complete, and his restoration to the abodes of the blessed in sight. Like the sages of the Far East, he preached the kinship of all living things, the sacredness of animal life, and the pollution incurred by eating meat. A deep vein of Oriental pessimism also enters into his theory of existence. Standing alone, such utterances might be interpreted as no more than an enthusiastic expression of the new Orphic religion, derived proximately from the Pythagorean schools of South Italy. The puzzling thing is that they have come down to us in close association with a thoroughly materialistic philosophy, where no place seems to be left for an immortal human soul, and hardly even for gods, except as poetic names for the elements and forces of nature. Empedocles lived toward the middle of the 5th century B.C. One is tempted to think of him as a modernist in reference to the religion of his age, giving a mythological coloring to speculations really destructive of all mythology. 3. The four elements. No wise man, the Sicilian philosopher tells us, would imagine that mortals had no existence before their birth, and will have none after their dissolution. These words might be taken to imply the soul's eternity, but probably they mean no more than that the body is composed of imperishable parts. Empedocles is credibly reported to have been a pupil of Parmenides, and he repeats the master's assertion that what is can neither begin nor cease to be, but without pushing it to the extremity of denying all reality to change and motion. What men call birth and death are simply a mixture and separation of pre-existing substances. Fire, air, earth, and water are the ultimate elements whence all things arise and into which they return. Each of these has been erected by one or other of the Ionian thinkers into the sole principle of nature. Empedocles follows the facile method of eclectics in every age, by granting equal rights to all, and his philosophy has left a permanent stamp on language, which the discoveries of modern chemistry have not been able to efface. 4. Love and strife. The tendency to harmonize and combine carries him on to a further and more daring speculative effort. Parmenides has to be reconciled not only with common sense, but also with Heraclitus. Experience tells us that the world is not now constituted as a perfect homogeneous sphere, in the way dreamed of at Alea, but that happy consummation has been reached already in the eternal revolutions of existence and will be reached again. Two powers control the universal process: love and strife. Love drawing the elements into one, strife tearing them apart, and the whole world cycle passes through four phases distinguished by their alternating predominance and decline. As love gains ground, things draw together. When it triumphs, they are united in the perfect sphere, but only to fly asunder on their way to complete separation when strife becomes lord of the ascendant. We are now on the downgrade, that is to say, we are living in a period of increasing differentiation and ever greater subjection of nature to the law of strife. Empedocles may have been led to this gloomy diagnosis by the sentence in which Heraclitus speaks of war as the father of all things. Love and strife answer in some ways to the attractive and repulsive forces of modern science, but they are conceived as material, or at least as extended objects, with just as much or just as little self-consciousness as the four elements. We ourselves are composed of all six, and as like is only known by like, we recognize the presence of each in the external world through that portion of it which helps to make up our separate individuality. 5. Theory of sensation. A current phrase speaks of the external world as known to us through the channels of sense. The phrase is now merely metaphorical, but it contains a reminiscence of what Empedocles thought literal truth. He imagined that streams of material particles emanated from the bodies about us, and that these made their way through certain minute passages or pores, with which the organs of sense were supplied, thus producing the characteristic sensation by which the element within is enabled to recognize the element from without as akin to itself. There is an exact adaptation between the particles and the pores of the same element, so that fire, for example, is only penetrable by fire and water by water. By this theory, much more than by his ambitious cosmology, Empedocles showed himself an original and progressive thinker, in harmony, like Zeno, with the minutely analytical tendencies of his age, and contributing far more than Zeno to the subsequent development of speculation. End of Section 7. Section 8 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 3, The Analytical Philosophers, Part 2. 6. Glimpses of Modern Science. Like his Ionian predecessors, the wonder-working Acrogantine poet has a place in the history of science, no less than in the history of philosophy. He divined the truth that light travels with an appreciable velocity. He knew that the revolution of one body round another can only be maintained by the composition of two forces, a centrifugal and a centripetal, and he recognized the sexual reproduction of plants. He even suggested the famous doctrine of the non-survival of the unfit, afterwards borrowed from him by Lucretius. And if we could take the account already referred to of his triumphal progress through Sicily as less an expression of intoxicated personal vanity than a dream of the victories in store for human knowledge, no Greek would be so justly entitled to the name of a prophet. 7. Melissus. Empedocles founded no school. After him the scene changes once more to East Hellas, and the language of philosophy relapses from poetry to sober prose. But through all external vicissitudes, the new method of infinitesimal analysis is maintained, leading to fresh conquests in the invisible world. Change of scene was indeed the best possible security for continued progress. It saved speculation from sinking into a routine. Unlike Moab, the Greek genius did not settle on its lees, but was emptied from vessel to vessel. escaping the reproach of a taste that remains and a scent that is not changed. In East Hellas, as in Sicily, the problem was to reconcile Heraclitus with Parmenides, the theory of an unceasing flux with the theory of an unchanging reality. We may assume that the Ephesian philosophy was well known and widely canvassed in those parts ever since its first introduction, seeing that its fame had spread within a few years to Italy. And we have proof positive that the Eleatic philosophy was studied in Ionia by a contemporary of Empedocles, the Samian admiral Melissus, who defeated an Athenian fleet in the year 440 B.C. This remarkable man, the only speculative sailor mentioned in all history, wrote a prose treatise of which considerable fragments survive, reproducing the main ideas of Parmenides with some important variations. Unlike the master, he declared that the eternal reality was without a bound, identifying it, as would seem, with infinite space, and while denying movement or multiplicity to absolute being, he allows them at least a place in thought as illusions of sense. Such an enlargement of view meant much. How much will be apparent when we come to study the grandest result of early Greek thought, the atomic theory. 8. Atomism. Before explaining how the theory of atoms arose, let me explain what it means. Atomism implies, first of all, that matter, or the substance of which bodies are composed, while it occupies space and is therefore extended, is not, like pure space, continuous, but discrete. That is, it consists of perfectly distinct and separate parts moving about in void space, solid, indivisible, impenetrable, differing from one another only in size and shape, capable of being united together in mechanical groups, but only communicating with one another by external contact and collision. In the next place, the atoms are so small as to lie beyond the reach of our senses, but assuming space to be infinitely extended, they are infinite in number, for otherwise the universe would in the course of infinite ages have disappeared by dissipation into the surrounding void. They are also eternal, for the least tendency to decay acting through endless time would equally have involved their total annihilation before the present date. And being indestructible, there is no reason to suppose that they ever began to exist, not to mention the general inconceivability that out of nothing something could arise. Evidently, the atom of Greek philosophy is an incomparably more meager idea than the atom of modern science with its formidable outfit of energies, conceived as endowed with gravitation, cohesion, elasticity, radioactivity, electromagnetic properties, and chemical affinities. At the same time, we must remember that all this elaborate mechanism has been built up, stone by stone, on the simple foundation supplied by the constructive genius of two Ionian Greeks, Leucippus, whose birthplace is unknown, and Democritus, a native of Abdera on the barbarous Thracian coast, enjoying little popularity in their lifetime and unhonored after death, even by the inheritors who traded most successfully on their discoveries. 9. Leucippus. From the scanty information supplied to us on the subject, it appears that Leucippus, the real founder of atomism, lived a little after Empedocles and Melissus. Generalizing from the doctrine of subtle material emanations as the cause of external perception put forward by the one, he would form the conception of multitudinous invisible particles as the basis of all real existence, and the infinite space of the other, dissociated from its material contents, would supply him with the equally essential conception of a void, giving full scope for their movement and interplay. By a remarkable anticipation of what is now called atomicity,
He supposed that these particles, or at least some of them, were supplied with little hooks by which they became woven into chains and membranes, ultimately forming, so to speak, the cell wall of a closed universe, within which the cosmic evolution of order out of chaos was conducted. Nothing, he said, happens by chance, everything by law and necessity, or, as we should say, by purely mechanical causation. For the original cause of motion, Greek atomism refers us to weight, which at that time seemed to be an inseparable quality of matter. It had not yet been discovered that the fall of heavy bodies was connected with a tendency to move towards the center of the earth, nor was it known that bodies falling in a vacuum move with equal velocities, so that collisions between them cannot occur. Accordingly, Leucippus credited all his atoms alike with a downward motion through infinite space, and he supposed that the larger atoms, having a greater velocity than the smaller, would overtake, collide, and become entangled with them. As the knowledge of astronomy and physics spread, the inconsistency of this primitive atomism with natural law came to be understood, and therefore no man of science after Democritus ever adopted it in antiquity, although the contrary has been stated by ill-informed literary critics in our own day. 10. Democritus. Democritus seems to have adopted the atomic theory of Leucippus without any essential modification. What distinguishes him as a philosopher is the enormous range of his interests. We have seen that the love of knowledge for its own sake was recognized at a very early time as the characteristic feature in philosophy. Democritus expressed this passion vividly by saying, "I had rather discover a single new explanation than be king of Persia." But his ambition went beyond a knowledge of things which taken alone is merely science. He asked, what was the nature of knowledge itself, thus giving a still wider extension to philosophy, of which that question has ever since formed an integral part. And he seems to have been the first to point out the distinction, since grown so familiar, between the two great sources of knowledge: sense, which gives us the appearances, and understanding, which gives us the reality of things. He owed it to the atomic theory. Atomism is a reasonable inference from our sensations, but at the same time, in a way, it denies them. As he puts it, sweet and bitter, hot and cold, exist by convention, or as we now say, subjectively. Color exists by convention, in reality, atoms and the void. So little truth is there in the reproach commonly brought against the materialists, of whom Democritus was a precursor, that they believe nothing but the evidence of their senses. 11. Moral philosophy. Philosophy, however, is not complete, even when we have added a theory of knowing to our theory of being. Man is by nature not only contemplative, but active, and even more active than contemplative. Accordingly, if we would attain true universality, to those other theories, a theory of practice must be added. And just as he who takes all knowledge for his province must needs simplify the task by an effort of extreme generalization, by going back to first principles, by singling out the fundamental element, or the original cause, or the widest law of things, or again by fixing on the true criterion of knowledge, so also the supreme master of practice will make it his object to pick out from the infinite details of social intercourse, politics, industry, and fine art, the absolute end to which everything else is a means, which alone gives a real value to all those multifarious activities. In a word, as the later Greeks put it, after physics and logic comes ethics, or the philosophy of conduct. It proves the wonderful genius of Democritus as a systemizing thinker that he took not only the second step, but the third. Here also as in the case of the Milesian school, with their general theories of the world as a natural growth, the absence of an organized priesthood teaching a fixed theology was essential to speculative freedom. After the first outburst of scientific speculation, there had indeed been a danger that the great religious revival we call Orphicism might intervene to check its further progress, at least in the direction of bringing conduct also under natural law. And not to speak of the Pythagoreans, there are very marked symptoms in Empedocles of a desire to keep well with the mystical movement, a nervous anxiety to disclaim too great freedom of thought. Now, for the atomists, at least, there could be no such obscurantist leanings. While formally acknowledging the possible existence of superhuman beings, their theory left no place for gods in any true sense of the word. In a world where the atoms alone were eternal, where necessity and mechanical law alone ruled, there could be neither creation nor providence nor immortality. Democritus, in fact, boldly explained theology as a primitive personification of natural objects. At the time when Democritus taught, which seems to have been in the last third of the 5th century B.C., ethics was, as it still continues to be, much less advanced than physical science. But the facts of moral experience being better known, left less room for error. Thus what he had to say on the subject took the form of proverbial philosophy, of short sentences, true so far as they go, but not worked up into systematic form. They are not inspired by the great social enthusiasm of Plato and the Stoics, but neither is there the low standard vulgarly supposed to go with philosophical materialism. The highest end is declared to be a contented mind, which is won by avoiding excess, and by fixing the desires not on sensual indulgences, but on imperishable things. Sins are to be avoided not from fear, but from a sense of duty. Goodness is not abstinence from doing wrong, but from the wish to do wrong. Encouragement and persuasion are a better training to virtue than law and compulsion. The whole world is the fatherland of a good soul. Yet our aphorist is too genuine a Greek to merge political duty in a vague cosmopolitanism. He tells us to put the interests of the state above all others, not grasping at more power for ourselves than is good for the community. For a well-administered city best secures the safety of all. Democritus has been called the laughing philosopher, because a late legend describes him as always making merry over the follies and vices of mankind. As it happens, this silly story is sufficiently answered by one of his own maxims. Men should not laugh, but mourn over each other's misfortunes. And to those who know Heraclitus at first hand, the parallel designation of him as the weeping philosopher must seem an equally infelicitous description of his lofty contempt for the common herd. End of section 8.
Section 9 of Early Greek Philosophy by Alfred William Benn. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain, read by Pamela Nagami. Chapter 3, The Analytical Philosophers, Part 3. 12. Anaxagoras. Anaxagoras of Clazomenae, who has been reserved for the last place in this chapter, was older than any of the thinkers who have so far been dealt with in it. But as a link with the schools of Athens, it will be found more convenient to discuss his teaching after that of the atomists, with the earliest form of which he may have had some acquaintance. Our informants tell us that Anaxagoras was born about 500 B.C., that he settled in Athens when entering on middle age, and remained there for 30 years. His was the true philosophic temperament. Asked what made life worth living, he replied, "Contemplating the heavens and the universal order." The great statesman Pericles was his pupil and friend. Euripides is mentioned among his admirers, and is believed to have had the Ionian sage in mind when he wrote these noble lines: "Happy is he who has learned to search out the secret of things, not for the citizen's bane, neither for aught that brings an unrighteous gain, but the ageless order he sees of nature that cannot die, and the causes whence it springs, and the how and the why. Never have thoughts like these to a deed of dishonour been turned." Footnote. Translated by Madame Duclos. In their religious beliefs, however, neither Pericles nor Euripides represented average public opinion at Athens. There may have been as superstitious communities in Hellas. None were so suspicious of new views or so intolerant. Possibly the wonderful cleverness of the Athenians made them more keenly alive than other Greeks to the dissolving effect of the new speculations on the old beliefs. We have seen that, in fact, from Thales on, the radical incompatibility between the two was becoming more and more obvious. A crisis was bound to come at last, and it came at a spot where political animosities and democratic jealousies helped to organize the forces of reactionary prejudice. 13. A martyr of science. In the year 432, an attempt was made to dislodge Pericles from the position he had long occupied as the trusted leader of the Athenian people. For tactical reasons, his assailants began by bringing charges of impiety against Aspasia, his wife in all but name, the great sculptor Phidias, whom he had employed for the embellishment of the Acropolis, and Anaxagoras. The charges against Aspasia and Phidias were of a frivolous character, and do not concern us here. Against the Clazomenian philosopher there was, unhappily, a very strong case. He taught that the sun was a red-hot mass of stone, larger than the Peloponnesus, that the stars were not fire, that the moon was an earthy body, shining by reflected light with an irregular surface and partially built over. Now at Athens the sun and moon passed for being blessed gods, and a pious belief prevailed that they were worshipped as such by the whole human race. To treat them as lumps of inanimate matter seemed therefore not only irreligious but absurd. According to some of our authorities, Anaxagoras was tried for blasphemy and condemned. According to others, he escaped condemnation by a timely flight from Athens. It seems certain that he ended his days at Lampsacus in an honoured old age, among a people who contrived to reconcile their reverence for the sun and moon with their reverence for intellectual and moral grandeur. At his own desire, the philosopher's death was annually commemorated by giving a holiday to the children of the town. His image may still be seen on the coins of his native place, Clazomenae, probably copied from a statue erected there in his honour. 14. Qualitative atomism. Democritus observed with truth that the astronomical heresies which brought Anaxagoras into such trouble were not new. Nor was it new to say, although a fragment of his states it as something paradoxical and unfamiliar, that what people commonly call becoming and perishing is really the combination and separation of pre-existent parts. For Empedocles had preceded him in starting with this assumption. The originality of Anaxagoras lay in giving this great principle an extension undreamed of by any of his predecessors or contemporaries. According to him, not only does the mass of matter remain a fixed quantity, but its qualities also are permanent. That is, such properties as temperature, colour, smell, and the like. There is always the same amount of these in the world, more or less latent, more or less apparent, as they are more or less confused or distinct. In the beginning the confusion was infinite. Analysis might have gone on forever without arriving at an ultimate element that did not combine all shapes, temperatures, colours, smells, and tastes. What the atomists declare to exist only by convention, or, in modern parlance, subjectively, is objective, real, eternal. And even now the separation of qualities is not perfect. Everything contains a trace of everything else. What we say of human nature, that no man is quite without good or without evil, without wisdom or without folly, Anaxagoras said of all nature. 15. Nous. How then, from the primal confusion, did the present world of order, of at least relative distinction, arise? The answer is strong and simple. All things were together. Then nous, reason, came and disposed them in order. Such words suggest the idea of an intelligent first cause, and in fact that was what Greek readers at first took them to mean. But it has always remained doubtful what Anaxagoras himself understood by nous. In some respects he clearly conceived it as like human reason, but with far greater powers. It knows everything about everything and controls everything. On the other hand, if not exactly a material, it is an extended substance, the thinnest and purest of all things, unmixed with the elements, and enabled by this absolute separateness, of which it is a unique example, to act on them. Its action, however, is of a merely mechanical kind, and has no other effect than to set up a vortical movement, by which the component elements of the original mixture are segregated, what is unlike being parted, and what is like being thrown together. If, as seems the only possible interpretation of his words, Parmenides identified pure reason with pure space or extension, we may presume that Anaxagoras adopted this view from the Eleatic philosophy. Some modern thinkers have called space the possibility of movement, and paradoxical as the idea may seem to us, an ancient thinker may well have expressed the connection between the two by saying that space was the cause of motion. Such a confusion had indeed already become quite incredible to Plato and Aristotle. They supposed that when Anaxagoras talked about reason as an ordering power, he meant something like the reason of an architect or a legislator. And so when in the sequel they found him treating the evolution of the universe as a process of mechanical causation, they could not reconcile such materialism in the details of the system with the spiritualism of its first principle. On the other hand, the modern interest in evolution, as at first an unconscious process and only becoming self-reflective in its last stages, gives us perhaps a clearer insight into the true significance of nous than was possible to the great founders of idealism. To describe it as an anticipation of Herbert Spencer would of course be an anachronism. Yet there is at least a germ of the differentiation and integration that Spencer made so much of in the activity ascribed to the cosmic nous by Anaxagoras. And perhaps it was the consciousness of their own reason as a discriminating and identifying faculty that led both philosophers to look on all nature as exemplifying the same process on a far vaster scale. 16. Diogenes of Apollonia. As it happens, the Greek word of which differentiation is the exact equivalent was first brought into use by Diogenes of Apollonia, a second-rate Dorian eclectic, who popularized the study of natural philosophy at Athens by combining the doctrine of Anaxagoras with that of Anaximenes. Anaximenes had taught that air was the fundamental principle of existence, the substance out of which all things are made, the animating soul of man, and the great conservative force of nature. Diogenes took the further step of identifying this elemental air with the nous, thus, as might seem, giving more prominence to the material and mechanical side of the latter. In point of fact, however, he laid more stress than Anaxagoras on the evidences of design in nature, the beautiful harmonies of which, according to him, could only be explained as the work of an intelligent cause. During the 5th century great progress was made by the Greeks in the study of physiology, and this science came to exercise an even more decisive influence on speculation than mathematics and astronomy. We see this in Diogenes, who was indeed a doctor by profession, and the idea of differentiation, to which, as has been said, he first gave a name, would be especially brought home to him by his knowledge of the human organism, affording, as this does, a most complete example of the division of labour. Of course, the uses of its various parts were then very imperfectly understood, but Diogenes was sagacious enough to conjecture that the vascular system, of which he wrote a careful account, had something to do with the distribution of air, or, as we should say, oxygen, over the whole body, and he acutely explained the absence of intelligence in plants to their want of such a system. 17. Aristophanes. Aristophanes, the great comic dramatist of the age, wrote a play called The Clouds, satirizing the philosophers in the year 423 B.C., and from this we can gather that the system of Diogenes was then the fashionable philosophy at Athens. The poet had no eye for the religious value of the new theories, regarding them solely as an impious attempt to substitute material agencies for the time-honoured Olympian divinities, with the belief in whom he conceived the interests of private morality to be inseparably bound up. In this respect he thoroughly represented the public opinion of Athens, already exhibited in the persecution of Anaxagoras, and destined, under the guidance of the greatest Athenian thinkers, to lead Greek philosophy away from the physical studies it had pursued with such success into other directions, more in harmony with the religious genius of the city, where it was henceforth to find a home. End of section 9.